Our guest tonight is Cate Montana. Cate is innately curious and relatively fearless about it. Questions and answers have formed the foundation of Cate Montana's life, that and communication. She's worked in network television for ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, ESPN, and the BBC. She's worked in radio, newspapers, and marketing. Now her passion for self-realization and discovery and implementation of feminine life values and sustainable lifestyles has impelled her into the literacy world. Former publisher of the online magazine The Global Intelligencer and the widely popular Bleeping Herald for the international hit film What the Bleep Do We Know, Cate has published hundreds of articles in the mainstream press, including the Seattle Post-Intelligencer and the Tacoma News Tribune. She's also worked as a Northwest bureau chief for the National Native American newspaper. She's done films and all kinds of other stuff. Such a very interesting lady. Without any further delay, let's get her on the line. Cate, good morning. Welcome to AM 630 and the Fringe Radio Show.
Hi, Pat. Wonderful to be with you tonight.
Well,
or this morning.
Well, exactly. Well, yeah, you're. It's not quite morning there yet.
No, it's 11:15 p.m. I'm on p.m. on the Pacific Coast.
Well, there you go. Well, Cate, it's an honor to have you on the show. And I was going through your website and just looking at all the stuff you do. You just kind of run the whole gamut.
Apparently. It's really bizarre actually listening to show hosts pitch me in as like, really? Who's that? Who are they talking about? What lifetime was that?
Well, hey, the thing is it's so fun to experience so many different things. But why don't you give our listeners, of course, I just scratched the surface, but why don't you give our listeners a little bit of the backstory of your career in media and kind of where you are today and kind of how things started and what's Cate Montana all about?
Well, that's a really good question, Pat. I'm still trying to figure that out myself. I started off life as a kind of a spoiled brat on the East Coast in a very privileged world of horses and private schools and hunt breakfasts and hunt balls and the Washington, D.C. diplomatic corps scene and went from there after I graduated from college with an English degree, which prepares a woman or a guy for absolutely nothing in life. I always wanted to be a writer, but I ended up dating a disc jockey, and one thing led to another, and I started hanging out at the radio station with him and met an engineer with an affiliate TV station, WIS-TV, in Columbia, South Carolina, ended up in network television, which was about the farthest thing from anything that I'd anticipated in my life. But, broadcasting, once it gets in your blood, it's kind of hard to get it out of your blood.
I know. I know.
So, I worked in television back in production. I started off as a tape operator at WIS-TV. It was an on-the-job training situation back in the 70s. I don't know how old you are, but maybe that was before your time.
Early 50s.
Okay. So, it was an equal opportunity employment kind of situation back then. And it was interesting because when I was hired as a tape operator, strictly because I was a woman and they didn't have any women in the production department of the TV station. And they were desperate to get women in, and I was desperate to get out of school and just have a job. Mm-hmm. And television was like, wow, how much more romantic can it be except for Hollywood to be in television? So, when I was offered the job by the engineering department, it never occurred to me that it was kind of insulting that they didn't give a who I was or what I really had to offer as a human being, as an individual. All they wanted to know was that I was a woman and, had an MS before my name and that I would fill a quota back in the bad old days of discrimination and all that. So, but I didn't care. I wanted an interesting career, and I thought television was cool, and I always wanted to be kind of like one of the guys, and there was never a time in my life when I didn't want to kind of like hang out with the guys and do a good job and be as good as a guy. It was kind of one of those subconscious things that drove me. Oddly enough, as a woman, perhaps that was the kind of motivation that drove a lot of women back in the 60s and 70s. But it certainly drove me. And so television was talk about a high-octane, high-adrenaline, holy Moses, hang on to your hat. If I screw up on network TV in front of 15 million people doing slow-motion replays, it's like, man, you never get hired again.
Very true.
Very true.
Very true. And it's funny too. It's funny too, Cate, because you can relate. People who haven't. I don't have nearly the amount of time in radio. I did radio years ago back in Chicago for a little bit, kind of an intern position that turned into a few things for me. I'm an IT guy by day. I have a regular day job, and we do this show 6 nights a week.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's a commitment.
What's a calling, I think. And as you know, they're really people think about it. There's really nothing glamorous about it. I mean, in today, especially with the advent of the internet, and just about anybody can be a podcaster out of their basement, and that whole line of technology is now going so far. I mean, that is just, gosh, you look at all the big TV people, but then you look at someone like Adam Carolla, who gets more hits, more numbers, more views, more eyeballs than ABC does right now, and he's on the internet. Just to name a few, but. I know I'm digressing a little bit, but there's nothing glamorous about it. It is pretty crude at the end of the day. But it's fun. It
is fun, and I think that's the whole thing. And what a remarkable, at the same time, good God, I mean, stop to think about it, Pat. 40 years ago, there were 65 independent news organizations in the United States operating at a major level, presenting our country with news and different news orientations. And now, 40 years later, there are 5 corporate news organs.
Yes.
And, I can't tell you how many times I have conversations with friends from Europe, England, the EU, Austria, and they're just like shocked at the lack of level of news coverage, the homogenization of news coverage in this country.
Well, and that's the one thing that one of the things is K-Talk, or AM 630. We are the third oldest talk radio station in the nation.
Really?
Yes. Yeah. We're coming up on our. We're going to be coming up very shortly on 50 years,
wow.
And we're an independent. There's not a lot of independent stations anymore. They're either an NBC, a Fox affiliate. I mean, of course, we use different affiliate news and stuff like that because we don't have a news desk here. But independent radio is just so. I mean, it's a dying art. It's amazing. And when I travel a little bit, tune into these AM and even the FM stations, these independent stations,
mm-hmm.
people need to. I mean, it's a lot of it's volunteer work.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot of hard hours. It's a lot of time, but it definitely is. It's still unique, and it makes it. It's just very different, and that's why. The independent radio stations can give people opportunities if they're willing to work hard. Where with the big stations, you command the big salary, but they're few and far between, and you're told what to say and when to say it.
Yeah, absolutely. So what a blessing that you're the fringe of the fringe.
We are. So anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just wanted to interject that I do find it interesting, and I've done a little bit of work with television, with a television station here in town. Same thing, nothing too glamorous about it at the end of the day. But boy, once it gets in your blood, it's hard to get rid of it.
Yeah, and I always wanted to be a writer, so I ended up, and which is why we're talking tonight, is I wrote this book called Unearthing Venus, My Search for the Woman Within, which is this whole study on gender dynamics and prejudice and the marginalization of the feminine in the West. And if I have to say, Pat, if there was anything in the whole wide world that I never ever would have thought that I'd gotten involved in, it would have been anything to do with gender issues, because come on, I was raised in the 60s, and so I'm doing all this equal opportunity manning up in the 70s, and I'm out there on the on the playing field miking and doing slow motion replays and for Monday Night Football and ABC and doing ESPN. Well, ESPN didn't come into the world until about 1981,
right,
1982. Right. But and I kind of like ignored the whole freaking feminist movement all of my life, because it was like, well, I can do anything that a man can do. I can, have the education. I'm free to have the same job opportunities, and I kind of looked at the whole feminist movement and just went, I don't get it. What's wrong with you ladies? Don't you see we have it all? And it was a real shocker for me to fast forward to 1999, when I was 48 years old. I was working as the Northwest Bureau Chief and editor of the national Native American paper, Indian Country Today. Mm-hmm. And this is how the whole saga started. I was interviewing a guy who turned out it was a shaman from the Amazonian regions of Brazil. He was a member of the Shuar tribe. And so I'm doing this interview, and I don't even remember what the real issue was, but we got off on this tangent, and he started talking to me about gender differences between his tribe and a lot of other Amazonian tribes and the Western civilization I come from, the United States. And the more he talked, the more intrigued I became. And so he just went on, and he started talking about his tribe and how men and women were considered equally important, and tribe men and women were equally represented on tribal council. And yet the jobs that men and women did were incredibly sex-oriented. The guys did guy things, and the women did gal things. The guys hunted and fished and cut down trees to make canoes and weapons and huts, and the women did the domestic chores and took care of the kids and did the whole wild edible gathering thing. But he said, even though our sexual roles are very segmented and along sexual, gender, mm-hmm. He said, we're totally egalitarian. He said, but we don't have this thing in our tribal system like you guys, this battle of the sexes thing that you guys do in the West. We don't even understand where this comes from. He said, we in our tribe, we understand that men and women are very, very different. They have different capacities, different characteristics, different qualities. He said, like we know that guys are like really driven. We're like really body oriented. We're like we do, and we're very aggressive. We tend to be this way, and and we're very on target, goal oriented. And he said, and we understand that women are much more holistic. They're much more intuitive. They're much more relational. They are about relationship and understand the needs of the tribe and the needs of of the family and the larger family called the environment.
Right.
And he said, so given what we understand about men and women, we try very hard. Our whole tribe is geared towards supporting each other out of our weaknesses towards our strengths. And he said, so that given, and there's total egalitarian in the tribe between men and women, he said, that given, we understand that the women are actually given one task that's the most important job in the whole tribe, and that the tribe's survival depends on the women performing this one task. And I'm like, we're so out of the ballpark on whatever I was talking to him about for the whole interview, and I'm like intrigued, and I'm going, wow, well, what's that one task? Having babies? And he was like, well, no, that was very important. But he said, but we understand that given man's aggressive nature, we know that we'll hunt until there's nothing left to kill. We'll fish until there's nothing left in the rivers, and we'll cut down the trees until there's nothing left standing. He said, we depend on the women to tell us when to stop.
Sort of the brains of the operation. Well, the brains and the common sense of the operation.
The intuitive, grounded in a relationship with the needs of the community, including the larger community called the Earth. And he said, when he said that, Pat, it was just like everything in my world just stopped. And I was like, it was like talking to somebody from Planet X. It was like, oh my God, I'm talking to this guy from quote unquote a primitive tribe in the Amazon. and he's talking about qualitative differences between men and women, playing to one another's strengths and bolstering one another so that their society is well balanced and harmonious and very, very healthy. And then as I'm kind of chewing on all this, he about kicked me right in the teeth with his next question. He asked me, he said, we in the Amazon, in our tribe, and the other tribes around are very, very concerned about where you people in the West are taking us. He said, where are your women in the West? What are they doing? And I said, well, we're reporters and bus drivers and teachers and lawyers and moms and wives. Why do you ask? And he said, look where you're taking the whole world. He said, why are you, women of the West, not telling your men to stop? Because your society is taking the whole world over a cliff. Why are you not telling your men to stop?
Wow.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah.
So that it floored me. That one conversation, Pat, changed the course of my entire life. I was merrily bopping along as a newspaper reporter, thinking that I was. I never even thought about whether I was equal or egalitarian, or had never thought about feminism in my life, or sexual roles. And all of a sudden, here's this guy from a tribe in the Amazon showing me a whole different picture of how society could function in a really balanced, healthy manner, and how men and women could really work to strengthen one another and have a healthy, balanced society with the world.
Right.
And I'm like, oh my God. So that put me on a course that has changed the last 15 years of my life. I've spent the last 15 years looking at my life and my culture through totally different eyes. I mean, all of a sudden I'm looking at, I'm looking through the lens of gender issues and about how different men and women are, how we're the same in our humanity, and yet how complementary we are. Are you familiar with the Chinese Taoist system of yin and yang?
Not enough to talk. I mean, I've heard of it, but I'll be honest with you, no, I don't know.
Okay, do you mind if I get into that?
Sure.
Okay. So in China, for thousands of years, they also have a, if you want to call it, gender-oriented view of life. And when I mean gender, and when I say masculine and feminine, I have to take it out of a sexual context.
Okay.
It's not about guys with penises and women with vaginas. It's just like, let's transcend that aspect of it and start thinking about gender, masculine and feminine, as archetypal patterns of creation. Kind of heavy, but it's really kind of simple. And the Chinese philosophy has always looked at life as polar opposites that balance one another. So if we go back to, let's zoom back to, God, when did the Big Bang happen? How many billions of years ago?
A long time ago.
Once upon a time, a long time ago, far, far away. We had the beginning of things, apparently, that started with a Big Bang, and less than 1 second after the Big Bang occurred, we already had polarity in the form of positrons and electrons. We already had positive and negative forces. Because we live in a dualistic, polarized physical reality. Without polar opposites, without polar opposite forces of negative and positive, we wouldn't have physical expression.
Right.
Okay? So, and if you've ever, and just to vault past the Chinese Taoist system, and I'll get back to that in just a second, if you're familiar at all, if anybody in the audience is familiar with a lot of different languages, for example, the French language, everything, every noun, every object, everything is either has a masculine, it's either a masculine noun or a feminine noun.
Right, correct.
Like pencil. A pencil. It's sharp, it's solid, it's pointy, and it's masculine. Le crayon. Okay?
Right.
So, and pen, interestingly enough, la plume, it's soft, it's feathery. It is a feather, indeed, and it soaks up a liquid. And it is la plume. It's feminine in its nature, in its qualitative nature. So this is what I mean about taking the masculine and the feminine to a more archetypal, rarefied form. Okay? And so back to China again. Okay, so the Chinese philosophy is that everything is either masculine in nature or feminine in nature. And again, it's not about man and woman and penis and vaginas. These are qualities. And the masculine yang qualities are, for example, intellectual, linear, single task targeted, self-oriented, goal-oriented, compartmentalizing, labeling. It's objective. It's has a tendency to be reactive, focused. It's an active, aggressive doing principle that is associated with light and dryness. Okay, that's the masculine. These are these yang qualities.
Okay.
You look at a pencil. It's hard, it's focused, it's rigid, okay? It's very active. You do a lot with a pencil. La plume, the feminine in French, is feathery and soft and pretty, okay? The feminine in the Chinese Taoist system called yin, yin qualities are nurturing, multidimensional multitasking. It's the feminine is intuitive, holistic. It's other and community oriented. The feminine is process oriented versus the masculine, which is goal oriented. Very accepting, relational, subjective rather than objective, yielding and pliable rather than rigid, responsive rather than the masculine reactive. So everything in the world that has been brought into form ever since the Big Bang and coalesced into matter dependent on polar opposites, okay, which are actually essentially not so much opposites as they are complementary characteristics and qualities that work together to create creation.
Interesting.
And yeah, fascinating. And and for lack of a better term, we call these qualities, these complementary qualities, masculine and feminine, yang and yin. So this is what that guy was talking about his tribe in the Amazon and how they operate. They understand that these complementary qualities, how they complement each other, and how to work with the different aspects. I mean, who in this world? Come on, Pat. Are you married?
Yes.
All right. Are you a little bit different than your wife?
Of course.
Do you come at things differently, think differently, approach things differently?
Yes.
Well, there you go. And it's not, neither is bad or wrong or better than the other. We're just different.
Well, and I think too, Cate, that, I mean, I think the whole approach to the male-female thing, now, like you were talking about when you started in broadcasting and radio and television, things I think have changed quite a bit over the years. I mean, like you said, when you were hired on, it wasn't realistically in a lot of cases back then, which is not that long ago. It was really not so much about how much you knew, what you knew. It was more of you were there to fill a quota. You know, they had to hire. In my life, I've hired a lot of people in my day job career over the years, and nowadays, of course, it's a little bit different. But not that many years ago, it was like, here's a bunch of resumes, but here's a bunch of black females. Why don't you take a look at those first? I work for some big companies, some major corporations, and I was kind of like, well, I think we're trying to fill this technical position. What should it matter if they're black, white, green, guy, girl? It shouldn't matter. I mean, we're trying to fill it. But it was like, well, we understand that, but take a look at these first. And
right.
I don't know, with all the research you've done, I think things have definitely changed.
Oh, yeah, tremendously. Tremendously.
But yeah.
And it's unfortunate that it's unfortunate now. That's a judgment, but it is the way it is, and things have transpired the way they've transpired in the last 60 years. And women came onto a men's playing field, and so I learned to pony up and work like a guy, think like a guy, act like a guy. I became very focused, very aggressive, highly competitive, probably more so than most guys because I had more to prove in those days.
Mm-hmm.
And but the point of my whole book, Unearthing Venus, and oddly enough, where my life has taken me, has been from that point of that conversation with that shaman when he talked about gender differences and how men and women could work together.
Yes. Welcome back to Fringe Radio. Our guest tonight, or this morning I should say, is Cate Montana. Cate, thank you so much for coming on at this time and sharing all your stuff with us. You're way later than I am, Pat.
Well,
yeah, we're an hour ahead. It's not too bad.
Not that bad.
But this is the time that brings out the listeners that want to listen to all the interesting stuff.
All the insomniacs in the world thinking about all the heavy things.
Exactly.
Going on in the world.
Exactly. So before the break, we were talking a little bit about writing the book.
Yeah. Well, bottom line, Pat, what happened is after that talking to that shaman and doing that interview with him, it was like I suddenly woke up and looked at my life and my whole world with different eyes. And I started seeing how much of a masculine-oriented world I lived in. And by masculine, I'm going back to those qualitative aspects that I listed before. That I lived in a very aggressive, competitive, dog-eat-dog, survival-based world. And, where I just really had to work harder and work longer and pony up and be focused. And it was just like, and there was so much emphasis on material acquisition and things and having stuff to prove that you were as good as or better than the next guy.
Right.
And, up until that point, sure, I mean, we're all familiar with that whole kind of picture, but it never registered, Pat, that my whole world was built around a very one-sided, lopsided value system. And after I talked to that shaman and he was talking about, the women the women told the men when to stop, and asking me, why are we as Western women not telling our men to stop? Stop the corporatocracy, stop the greed, stop the wars, stop the resource destruction. And it's just like, I was like, how could I possibly tell a man to do that?
Right.
I don't know how to stop. Number one, I'd be a hypocrite. And number two, how the hell would I even have the power to tell the men to do anything?
Right.
Because, and this was a real shocker for me to realize, is that as a woman, I don't have validity in my society as just a woman. Now, I have a great deal of validity as an author, or as an editor, or as a newspaper reporter, or as a radio disc jockey, or whatever. When I have a role that's something other than just being a woman, I have authority. But as a woman, for me to start standing up and going, wow, well, I think we need to have more compassion in the workplace. I think we need to have mitigation and economic packages for employees that are bumped when corporate mergers go over, and, all of a sudden we have redundancy in employment, and we need to take care of one another. And it's just like, man, everybody would point the fingers at me and go, why, are you a Marxist socialist commie? And it's like, no, I'm just kind of like thinking from my heart and going, it's, we need to be concerned and compassionate about our brothers and sisters. And it's just like, yeah, you pinko commie fag. It's just like, oh my God. It's like, but I never saw this orientation, Pat. I didn't get it until I had that conversation. And then all of a sudden my whole life became about looking at myself and my world through this question mark of, well, what is feminine power? And how do the women tell the men to stop? And how do men and women come to the agreement? How did the men and the women in the tribe come to that agreement? How did the men come to value what the women brought to the table? And how did the women come to value what the men brought to the table and strike a vocalized, conscious balance so that their culture and their community and their tribe and the environment that they lived in were harmonious and balanced?
Where do you think their values came from, Cate? I mean, obviously this was mind opening for you when you kind of lived in it, with your when you made that little statement, all I thought of was Carol O'Connor playing Archie Bunker, and truly that's how it was. I mean, for so long. Mm-hmm. Where do you think their value? I mean, where did they get their values? So when you experience this, where did that value system come from? Where do you think that came from?
Well,
where did it originate?
I think that's the $64,000 question. My best, it makes sense that they are still a very simple culture, relatively speaking. They're not highly technological. They're still very grounded in the earth and nature and natural processes. And so they've not walled themselves off in high-rise apartments and automobiles and air conditioning and iPods and movie theaters. And so, I mean, a lot of people, literally, their feet, not feet encased in rubber shoes, which isolate them from the ground and actually cut. There's been a lot of medical research that shows that when we wear these insulating shoes, we used to wear leather-soled shoes, mm-hmm. or moccasins, and that's a conductive material that is a natural product that doesn't insulate you from the electromagnetic field of the earth. But literally, there are probably a couple of billion people on this planet who are literally detached from the earth itself and whose feet never touch the ground. I mean, I'm amazed at how few people ever walk barefoot anymore, let alone barefoot outside.
Right. Right.
And, and if they are, well, when was the last time that the truck with all the chemicals to kill the crabgrass went through, et cetera, et cetera? And do you want to be walking barefoot on that particular patch of ground? But to get back to your question, I think that it comes from a culture that realizes that they are not separate from the world, that they're not the lawgivers, that they need to live in harmony and work with nature, that they're not white supremacists over nature,
right?
And that we are subject to nature, and that at best, and literally I mean this at best, we are stewards with nature. And so I think that they're humble enough and grounded enough in the world, in the physical world and in nature, to know that if they don't cooperate with each other and with nature, that they're screwed. And they're not arrogant enough to think that they know better than nature. They see themselves as part of, not separate, distinct, and overlords of nature.
Well, that was going to be my comment. Was I mean, I think that today, we hear about all these different things, all these different movements, if you will, that are going on. The clean air movement and the electric cars and wind turbines and solar and all the other stuff. And sadly, and I don't want people to take it the wrong way. I think right now that a lot of and without getting into heavy duty politics, I think that a lot of these movements, a lot of these, clean air and free, the energy, renewable energy and stuff, it's nothing more than a money making scam all the way across the board. I mean, look at Solera, look at all these, look at all this different stuff. Do I think it's a little bit, you hear the phrase a lot of times, we're doing a little bit too little, a little too late. I don't know if that's necessarily true, but I think that kind of as a general statement, we have kind of put this planet and the the ecology and the ecosystems and just the air we breathe. I mean, it comes down to, Cate, dollars and cents in so many cases. We have these. We have these disastrous oil spills. Now, I'm not saying it doesn't mean we don't stop drilling for oil, because, I mean, if tomorrow, if everything shut off, things would change. But I think we need to start moving in the right direction, but moving in the right direction for the right reasons, not doing it for someone to say, hey, let's go green, or let's go this, or let's go that. And at the end of the day, it's just about making more money. Mm-hmm. My opinion, for what it's worth.
Well, yeah, I hear you loud and clear on that. And, unfortunately, I think with our current orientation that is, I mean, we live in a economic world where this is the system that we've bought into and that we perpetuate. And perhaps, yeah, God knows, let me make it really clear, I sure don't have the answers, but I think that better that the trend be, oh, well, we better go green because we can profit from it. Better that than not going green at all, if you get my drift.
Right. I do. I totally do.
And I have a lot of friends who are in the ecological arena, and they lament that there's so much co-oping and riding on the coattails of green, as you say, to make a buck. So it's a two-edged sword, like a whole lot in our world. It's just like, is it good that Safeway is going organic? And it's like, yes. Are they making a buck on it? Yes. Are we profiting as human beings from a more healthy products? Yes. And at the same time, yeah, and then there's that bizarre stuff that goes on. Did you ever see a movie called Who Killed the Electric Car?
No, but it sounds like it's a Netflix, one of the Netflix type movies.
It was premiered at the Sundance Film Festival. Was released by Sony Picture Classics. And it basically tracked the very first major battery electric vehicle in the United States, which was built by General Motors, and it was called the EV1 in the mid-1990s. And that car was like so far ahead of the Prius and so far ahead of its time, and that the people that bought the EV1, I mean, it was like you'll take this car away from, you'll pry it from my cold dead fingers. It was they had 5,000 cars that were sent out as a prototype, and then they were recalled a couple of years later, and every single car was, forcibly taken away from the people who had signed up to use them, and every single car was crushed and destroyed.
Now, why would you think that?
Why would you think that? I have no idea. Because, GM came in at the top of the market. I mean, they were the predecessors far before Toyota. They were, California was, because of the success of the EV1 and people's enthusiasm for it. I can't remember the miles to the charge that the car got, but it was like, it went from, it was peppy, it was zippy. You could go for like 250 miles on a charge. It was just amazing. And the whole state of California was rapidly headed towards, well, why don't we, back the whole electric car thing, and we're going to have the battery recharging stations and yada yada. And then GM recalled it, and they were never heard of again. Yeah. And it's one of the major mysteries. It's just like, oh my God, a prototype that was that efficient came out in the mid-90s and then was recalled. Why?
Right.
I
know.
You want to talk fringe events?
We've got to take a news break. Can we keep you for another go around? We'll talk about more of these fun things and a little more in depth about your book.
Absolutely, I'd love to.
Okay.